Hey everyone, my name is Raeef, and this video is going to be part 3 of my series on how to start coding. So in front of me you can see part 2 of this series, which is posted on my blog website, and I'll leave a link to it down in the description. If you haven't done part 2 and part 1 of the series, and you can find both parts if you go up to posts, so this is part 1, this is part 2. If you haven't done these 2 parts, I highly recommend you work your way through them. But for those of you who have, welcome back. And we're gonna start off on part 3 of this series by creating a more advanced Scratch game. So before we get into creating our better Scratch game, I just wanted to show you a quick preview of what the game's gonna look like. So I'll pull up the game that we're gonna make today. Okay, so here it is. So let me just start it off and you can take a look what it's like. So you can see that we have a character here and we can shoot using our mouse, and we can control its direction using our pointer as well. And I can control the character's movements using keys on my keyboard, and I can take out these zombies that spawn in from the side. So you can see that as I take out the zombies, the number of enemies I've killed, the counter up here increases. It's 14, now it's 15, now it's 16, now it's 17, and the time I've survived is also increasing. Oops, looks like I got killed by the zombies. We can click the green flag to play again, but for now, I think we're good. And you can see my stats up here. I've killed 26 zombies, and I've survived for around 32 seconds. So, you've seen the game. Now, with no further ado, let's get into coding it. Okay, so to start off this tutorial, let's head on over to the Scratch website. Make sure you're logged into your Scratch account. And let's go ahead and create a new project. Okay, so once a new project is created, let's go ahead and start off by creating our fighter sprite, which is the sprite that our player will control. Okay, so before we even get to doing anything, let's go ahead to sprite 1, which is our cat, and let's rename the sprite over here to fighter, just so we know which one is which. Okay, so fighter. Now let's go on over to costumes, and this is basically where we're going to change the appearance of our sprite. So for this project, we're not going to need 2 costumes for our fighter sprite, so we can go ahead and go over to costume 2 and just delete it. And for costume 1, we're not going to need the cat, so we're just going to go ahead and just select everything here and just delete. Okay, great. So to make our fighter, let's just get a circle. And I'm just going to choose a circle, just change the colors a little bit. I want it to just be a white circle with a black outline. Very simple. I'm going to hold shift and then draw the circle to make it a perfect circle. And I think that's good. I'm gonna give it a little bit more of a border, and then I'm just gonna give it some simple arms. I'm gonna use a line tool and just draw it out like this. Very simple. And to draw the gun, let's just get the square tool and just draw a rectangle. And let's give it the fill, make it completely black. Okay. It's too much? Okay. I think that is good for our fighter character. Now, don't worry about the size too much here. We'll fix that later. But one last thing we're gonna do here is I want to select this entire sprite, like the object, and kind of, if you look closely, you'll see this kind of like blue crosshair thing, and you'll also see a gray crosshair in the middle, like right here. I want to just drag this over and snap it onto the gray crosshair to center the sprite costume. Okay, this will just make sure that whenever we're working on the motions on our sprite, that everything looks right and doesn't look funky. Okay, so now the fighter costume is done. Let's go back, and now let's fix the size. So let's set up some defaults for our sprite. To do this is pretty simple. Let's just go to events, get our when click block, looks, let's set the size to something like, I think 30. Sorry, not 309, 30. How's that? That's too small, actually. Let's set it to something like 40. 40 is good, but just to be safe, I'll say like 45. I think 45 is the sweet spot. Okay, we'll go with 45 right now. If you want to make it bigger, you can make it 50 or 60. It really depends on how big you drew it in your costumes or whatever. That's all up to you. It's customizable later. Okay, but for now, we're gonna go ahead and move on and set up some movements for our fighter character. So if you remember from the preview, our fighter should point towards wherever our mouse is and also move across the X and Y axis with arrow keys or WASD keys, with just using some keys on the keyboard. Okay, so to do this is pretty simple. Let's handle the pointing in direction first. So let's get a forever block, go to motion, and get the block point towards mouse pointer. Now if we run this, you'll see that the fighter is pointing to wherever our mouse pointer is. Great. Okay, so now let's set up some basic movement. So if you guys remember from the part 2 of the series when we controlled the boat, we're just going to use the same sort of logic. We're going to get an if statement and sensing with the key space down. So instead this time we're just going to use the same arrow keys, except this time it's going to move. We're going to use the X and Y blocks to move it. So I'm going to duplicate these, and we're going to make it up arrow, down arrow, left arrow, right arrow. Okay. So then let's go back up to motion, and let's get these two new blocks that we haven't used yet. Change X by and change Y by. Okay, so for the up, when the up arrow is pressed, we want to change our Y by some positive value. So we'll say something like 4. And when the down arrow is pressed, we want to change our Y value by a negative value, because we want the character to go down. So we're going to do -4. When our left arrow is pressed, we want to change our X by something negative, so some -4. And for the right arrow, we want to change it to a positive value, like 4. And for consistency, make sure that the main number you're using, like 4, is same throughout all of these, or else your character will be going one way faster than the other way. But the only thing you really need to change is just to flip from positive to negative for the directions. Now if we run this, it's pointing towards our mouse pointer, and oh, my bad, I forgot to put this into a forever loop. Sorry. Okay, now if we run this, it's pointing towards my mouse pointer, and if we press the arrow keys, sure enough, now our character is moving. And you can make this, you can change these values right here from like the up arrows to work with something like the WASD keys. So let me show you how to do that. So for our up arrow, if you prefer using WASD, you can make this a W. Down arrow would be S. Left arrow A. And D. I think so. Yeah. So now this works for WASD too. And you could also keep the arrow keys too to make it work with both of them. But for now, this is okay for us. Okay, great. So it looks like we now have our basic player movement working. So the next thing we're going to want to do is to set up the bullet shooting. Okay, so the first thing we're going to want to do to set up our bullet shooting mechanism is to go down here and create a new sprite, and we're going to want to paint a new sprite. So the bullet is really just a simple costume. It's just going to be a rectangle. So let's go ahead and just draw a simple rectangle, center it with the crosshair, and let's make this red. And I'm going to take out the outline. Really, you can make it whatever color you want. I just like red. And the size is not going to matter right now. We'll scale it down. So I'm going to go back to code. And let's get our when click blocked. And let's get a size block. Set size. And let's experiment around with whatever size works best. So let's see. Maybe you can try 30. 30 is too big. What about 15? 15 is actually much better, but I'm going to bump it up to, I think, around 17. I think that's the best. Okay, set size to 17. Great. So the next thing we're going to want to do is to set up the system which will actually spawn in bullets and shoot the zombies that are going to spawn on the screen. So a little bit of the tricky part here with the bullet sprite is that we need bullets to spawn the second we press, like when we shoot our weapon with our left mouse key. We want just the bullets to start spawning in and just going in whatever direction we shot them in. And the issue for that is, if we just use one sprite for this, what will happen is we'll only have one bullet to shoot. So the alternative is to create like multiple of these sprites. So let's call the sprite bullet. So we would have to create like bullet 1, bullet 2 by duplicating these sprites, but that's too much work. So let's just use a system that Scratch has inbuilt for situations like this. And this is called clones. So clones are essentially, basically what happens is when you create a clone of a sprite, it just copies that sprite, and now that clone has different logic that you can put inside of it to make it act different than the original sprite. So we're going to call the original sprite the master bullet. Okay, so what we want to happen is we're going to create a forever loop, and we're going to say that whenever our player clicks their mouse key, we're going to want to create a clone of the bullet and make it go forward and start from where the fighter is currently. So let's get an if block. Let's go to sensing. Let's get a mouse down. If mouse down, then. And what we're going to want it to do is to create a clone of myself, and you can get this block from the control section. So let's create a clone of myself. And then we're going to want to get the block that says when I start as a clone. Okay, great. So what we want to do here is when the bullet starts as a clone, or in other words, when the bullet is spawned in and when the user clicks the shoot mouse down key, we want the bullet to for now, let's just say for the bullet to move forward. So let's say move 10 steps. Okay, let's try this out. So let's start the project. Our player is here and ready to go. We can still control it. And when we press our mouse down, you can see that the bullet is firing from here. And if you hold down your mouse, it'll just spawn in this long streak of bullets. The reason this is happening is because we're not actually putting some sort of like wait or pause after right before we create another clone. So it's creating a clone and then just creating another clone right on top of that clone. So this will make sense, I promise. So just get a wait block from control and put it right after create a clone of myself and set it to something like 0.3. And you can essentially think of this wait block as controlling the fire rate. So if we start off again, and now if we click down and hold our mouse down, you'll see now there's a specific gap before the next clone spawns in, so you can see them clearly. Okay, great. So the next thing we want to do is to actually make the bullet start from where our player is. And another thing we need to handle is, so you can see how when the clones spawn, our master bullet, the original sprite, is still stuck here. So let's actually fix that one first before we move it to the player. So to fix this is actually pretty simple. What we want to do is we want to go into looks, and we want to get the block called hide. So hide will essentially hide our master bullet, or in other words, the original bullet. So let's hide this. Okay, so now when you start the project, you actually can't see anything happening even if you click down your mouse. Because what's happening is when the clones are created, it's inheriting the properties of the master bullet. So what we want is the master bullet to be hidden, but when the clones are created, we want them to show up again. So let's get the show block and put it right here when I start as a clone. So now if we start the project again, and we click down our mouse, you can see that the bullets are seemingly spawning out of nowhere, and these are the clones. And this is perfectly fine because we want the bullets to technically just spawn onto the player and not some like hard-coded sprite. So now all we have to do is to actually get this the master bullet, and which you can actually see by double clicking the bullet sprite right here. You'll see it highlights it right here, the purple highlight. So it's just hidden there. We want that hidden part to hover on top of our player and shoot out the clone bullets. So to do this is a little bit complicated, but I promise it will make sense. So the first thing we want to do is to make the bullet point in the direction of the player. So to do this is pretty easy. Go to motion, get the point in direction block, and go to sensing, and go and find the backdrop number of stage. And what we want to do is change this block to say of fighter, and we want to get the direction of fighter. Okay, great. And when our clone starts out, we want to point in the direction of the fighter. Okay, so show, point in the direction of the fighter, and start moving 10 steps forward, which is basically just the bullet moving forward. So now if we shoot, you'll see that the bullets are indeed, so when I move it with my mouse, they are actually following the direction of the player. Great. Okay, so next thing we need to do is actually mount the bullets to the player, because right now it's just spawning from the master bullet, which is right here. So to do this, we just need to make that master bullet go to our player. And to do this is, again, pretty simple. You can just use the go to block, and you can say go to fighter. And we can just put that right here. And when we run this now, you can see that the bullets are now spawning from the player. So let me full screen real quick. Perfect. So now the bullets are spawning from the player, and we can see it fire in that direction. Okay. So if you look closely, there is something weird happening. You can see the bullets are sort of showing up on top of the player. To prevent this is pretty simple. Let's just go into looks and find the block that says go to front layer, and let's just change this to back layer. And this should make the clone go behind the fighter. Okay, perfect. So now it's not, it doesn't look that weird anymore. Great. Okay. So the next thing that we need to fix is that you can see the clones of these bullets are just hanging out at the edge. So let's fix this. And so what we wanted to do is when the clones touches one of the edges of the Scratch project screen, we want it to delete or basically disappear. So to do this, let's find a sensing block that senses when we touch the edge of the stage. So here, perfect. Let's use the touching block. So let's say when touching edge, then we want to delete this clone. So let's get a different type of control block. Let's use the repeat until block this time. This might be useful. And what we wanted to do is basically we want to make the bullet repeat this specific logic, which is move 10 steps and make it go forward until it's touching the edge. So we can take out the forever loop. We don't need this anymore. And the second it detects that an edge is being touched, it'll just stop moving forward and it'll execute the next block below. So in the next block below, we want this one to be delete this clone, and you can get this from control as well. Okay, so let's try this. Now you can see when we shoot and the bullet touches the edge of the Scratch backdrop, it's disappearing. Great. So now the bullets are no longer just hanging around in the corners. Okay. Great. Okay. So that is the bullet, and the next thing we're going to want to implement is our enemy character. So our enemies, or basically our zombies, are just going to be very similar to our fighter. So let's just start off by creating a new blank sprite using the paint icon. Let's rename the sprite to enemy, and we wanted to sort of look like the sprite, our fighter human, because it's just a mutated version of the human, a zombie. So we can just copy this sprite by just dragging and making a box on top of it, clicking Control-C on our keyboard, going to the enemy, going into their costume, and just clicking Control-V to paste it. Great. So now we have our fighter sprite here. And we don't want our zombies to have a gun, so we'll just take that away. And let's change its color to, I don't know, maybe zombies can be red in this game. And we'll just make it center it in the middle. Great. We want to also copy some of the code from fighter to match the fighter size and everything. So what we can do is we can just drag this code right here, and we can sort of just drag it on top of the enemy, which will just copy the sprite. I mean, sorry, not copy the sprite, copy the code inside the sprite. So now fighter still has this code, but if you load up enemy, it also has a copied version of the code. Great. But we don't want the enemy to do have any of the motion logic as our fighter, so we'll throw all this out. We just wanted to set the size to 50. And for our enemy, what we want the enemy to do is something very similar to the bullet. So we're also going to copy code from the bullet, and we want to create a similar clone mechanism. So let's just copy this forever loop and bring it over to our enemy. And we don't need an if statement for our enemy because we just want it to spawn forever. So let's say create clone of myself, repeat for 0.3 seconds. We don't want enemies to spawn in that quickly. It's going to overwhelm our player. So let's make the wait 1 second. Let's go get a when I start as a clone block, and let's create some logic for it. So let's get another forever block, and we want our zombie to face our player and keep walking towards it. So to do this is pretty simple. Just get a point towards block and say point towards fighter, and move steps. And we don't want it to move that fast. It's a slow zombie, so we're going to say move 1 step. Okay, let's try this out. Okay, great. So you can see the zombies start spawning in from the master zombie, and they're following me around. Great, kind of creepy, but at least it's working. So the same thing we did with the master bullet, we need to hide the master enemy. So let's just go into looks, hide the main enemy, which is this one right here, and show the clones whenever they spawn in. Okay, great. So now the clones are sort of spawning in from this location. But we want the clones to spawn in from the other side of the screen to give our player a chance to be able to understand where they're coming from and actually react. So to do this, let's set up a spawn location for our enemies. And I don't want the enemies to just spawn from one location here. I want them to spawn anywhere from the far right top of the screen from to the far right bottom. So to do this, we can go to motion, and let's get a go-to block. And for this, I also want to show the master enemy. So let's go here, just click show, so you can see the master enemy. Okay, great. So I want them to spawn anywhere from up here to down here. So let's set up a specific X position. So we want them to spawn specifically in the X area of, let's say, 220. So specifically in the here to make sure that it's centered in the far right of the screen. But we want the Y value to vary. So we can have the Y value from anywhere, let's say like I guess 150. Yeah, anywhere from top here to, let's say, negative 150. So anywhere from there to there. Okay, great. So how can we do this? Well, we can go to operators and find the block that says pick random. So this will pick a random number from the range we provide inside of it. So just as we wanted for our Y value, we can pick a range from 150 to somewhere negative 150. And you can preview this by go ahead and clicking this block, and you can see it's generating random numbers. Perfect. So now let's just put this random number generator right into our Y-axis block. Great. And now let's put this entire block right into when I start as a clone. So actually, I want to put this before the show block. Sorry. So what we want the clone to do is when it starts off, before it even appears in the screen, to pick a random Y-axis to spawn somewhere on this side. Have the same X-axis though, because we don't want to spawn. We don't want it to spawn anywhere in like the middle of the screen. Show up and then point towards our fighter and move forward. So let's try this out. Great. So now they're spawning in and they are creepily following me. Okay, great. So that's our the logic for the enemy. Now we need to create some way that we can shoot our bullets and actually make sure that the enemies are killed and disappear off the screen. So let's work on that. Okay, so now let's make some logic so that the bullet and enemy disappear when they collide with each other. Okay, so to do this is actually very simple. the first thing we want to do is go to the bullet and add logic for the bullet to disappear when it touches the enemy. And doing this for the bullet is actually really simple because we already have some code written for it, which is the repeat until touching edge block. So we want to add some extra logic, and we can do this by just right-clicking and duplicating our touching edge block, and we want to make this touching fighter. So our logic should be repeat, which is repeating move 10 steps until the bullet either touches the edge of the screen or is touching the enemy, or if it's touching the enemy. So to get this or statement, it's pretty easy. We just go to the operators block and we get this or conditional block. And let's put the if touching edge or touching enemy block here. And let's just put this into the bullet repeat until loop. Okay, great. So now let's add some logic to the enemy. So let's move over to the enemy and let's add some collision logic here. So this will also be pretty simple. Let's just go and find an if then block, and let's say if sensing, and we'll say touching the bullet. And yes, this does work for clones of the bullet. So any clone of the bullet is actually also recognized as when you use the touching the bullet conditional. So this will work perfectly fine. And we want to delete this clone. So when we touch the bullet, we want the clone to be deleted because it's been shot and killed, the enemy's dead. Okay, so now when we run this, let's shoot the enemy. Great, so the enemies are getting deleted. Now, what's happening here is when enemies start spawning in, we can basically double kill an enemy with the same shot. So I can just use one bullet to, like, let's say wipe out these four enemies. Now, if you're okay with that, that's fine. But for those of you who don't want that to happen, let me show you a way to prevent that. So the easiest way to do this is to fix a bug that's actually happening in the game. So what's happening is when the bullet collides with the enemy is deleting, the enemy clone is deleting so fast that the bullet doesn't actually get a chance to delete itself. So the enemy is touching the bullet and then it's saying, okay, delete this clone. But that's happening so quickly that the bullet itself doesn't have the time to register if it's touching the enemy, which will delete itself. So to fix this, let's just go to enemy and let's add a small wait block right before we delete the clone. So let's just set this to something very small, like 0.1. So now when we run again and we shoot towards an enemy, now you'll see that it's only taking out one enemy. And one bullet can only take out one enemy, which makes it harder for the user to stay alive for a long period of time, which is great for us. Okay, so with that fixed, now we can move on to creating some things for our backdrop and our actual, like the death screen and everything. So let's go to stage and let's create some basic backdrops. So let's start off by creating our background, and I'm going to keep this very simple and just create a simple gray background. I'm going to go here, make it gray. If you want a more in-depth explanation on how backdrops work, please check out part 2 of this, the how-to code tutorial series, where I go through the game Treasure Island. I go more in-depth there, but for now we're just going to keep this quick and simple. So this is going to be our main backdrop, and I'm going to rename this to main. I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to call this next backdrop the game over screen. And I'm just going to write here a very simple "you died." Oops, you can't see the text. Sorry. Let's just change the text color to, let's make this like red. And of course, I had to spell died wrong. Okay, and let's make the text a little bit bigger. Center it on the screen, and let's add one more piece of text, which is going to be if click the green flag to play again. Okay, so let's just write click flag to play again. Now we can't really type the green flag icon, so I'm going to insert that in a different way, but for now just put multiple spaces to create a gap and say to play again, and just keep a gap there for now. And we're going to put the icon there in a second. So let's just try to see if we can center this. So I'm just going to drag this up to the crosshair and I'm just going to drag, and I'm just going to use the arrow keys to push it down to make sure it's centered. And to get this green flag icon is actually pretty easy. All we really need to do is go down here, and let's search for a sprite, and there's actually a sprite for the flag. So if you just type a flag, you'll find green flag, and we can just take this flag costume. So you can go here, and just as we did with the fighter, we can just copy this and go over to backdrops and paste it in here, which is pretty cool. You can basically just copy sprite costumes into backdrops and just size that and place it right here. Okay, great. And now we can just delete the green flag sprite. We don't need it. Okay, now we have our game over screen. So when we start off the game, of course, we want to start with our main screen. So let's just do that. So the start of game main. And now we need some way to make sure that the player knows when it has died or when it's touched a zombie. So let's add some more sensing code. And to do this, we're actually just going to copy some code we already wrote. And I'm just going to take the enemy. So I'm just going to take this code. I'm going to shove it over into fighter. Now we don't want our fighter to be a clone, so we're just going to take out some stuff here. Actually, a lot of stuff. And we're just going to make this if touching enemy, then that was a lot of unnecessary code, my bad. And we're going to just say stop all. But before we stop all, we want to do two things. We want to first hide our main character, because once we die, we don't want to show the main character anymore. And we want to also switch backdrop to game over. Okay, let's see how that works. Let's shoot some enemies, and if we get touched, oops, it's not working. Oh, silly me. I accidentally put the when I start as a clone block here. So let me go to control and get the right block. Sorry. That's a dumb mistake. Okay. Oops, we died. Okay, great. And the player disappears from the screen. Let's start the game again. And oops, our player is actually invisible now. So what happened here is when we died, we set the player to hide. But when we started the game back up again with the green flag, we never showed the player again because it remembers its previous state. So we just go to looks and get the show block and put it right here. And while we're here, another thing I want to quickly do is set a default position for our player. Because let's say we die over here on the far right hand side of the screen, and if we spawn in there again, there's a good chance we just might die on spawn. So let's set a default location for our player using the go to block. I'm just going to set this something to like, I think -210, and let's set the Y to 0. Okay, great. That's a good spawn location. Okay, so now that's fixed. Now we can kill our enemies, and when we get hit, we die. Okay, great. Now let's add some nice little extra features to the game, like music and some graphic effects, and also add our counters, our kill counter and a timer to see how long we've survived for some extra razzle dazzle. Okay then, we're almost done with the tutorial. And the last thing we're going to really work on is just adding some nice little extra features to our project, starting with sounds. So let's start off in the fighter sprite and make our way to the sounds menu. And let's find a sound that will play when our fighter is unfortunately killed. So let's look for a sound like crunch, which I like to use. Great. I think I like this one. So I'll just click it, put it into the project, and let's go to sound. And let's say play sound until done before we stop the entire project. Okay, once we're done with that, let's go on and head over to the bullet. And let's play a sound when the bullet is fired. So let's find a sound. Maybe we can look for a laser sound. Here's some lasers. I like laser 2 better, so I'm just going to click that and put it in the project. But remember, you can choose whichever one you want. And we are going to use, not play sound until then, we're going to use start sound instead. If you're wondering what the difference between start sound and play sound are, we covered that in part 2 of the tutorial, so it's a good refresher. Of course, I'll leave a link to those that blog and the video in the description below. And the last thing we're going to do is actually put a sort of sound effect in the enemy and actually put one in the create some background music maybe. Okay, so for our enemy, let's find a sound for when we shoot and kill one of them. So maybe we'll just go to some effects. That's too much. So we have some drums. Let's see if we can find a drum. Yeah, drum bass. Yeah, we can use drum bass 3. I think I like this one. Okay, drum bass 3. And let's just say start sound when touching the bullet. So start sound bass 3 when touching the bullet, and then the enemy will disappear from the screen and die. And then let's add some music to our backdrop. So I'm just gonna get a forever block and just put it right after we start the main menu. Let's go to sounds. I'm gonna find there's another one that I liked in percussion, drum satellite. Oh yeah, this is a nice song, and it sounds good when it repeats because it's just gonna repeat over and over again. Okay, great. So let's just get this and let's use the play drum satellite until done. Okay, let's try this out. Great. All 4 sounds are working perfectly fine. So now let's move on to some other nice little graphic effects that we can use. For example, a nice little kind of death animation, if you can call it that. So let's go to enemy, and let's basically make the enemy kind of flash a little bit right before it dies. So just a nice little detail to add. So we can do this by going into looks, and let's get a block that says set color to. We can change this to set brightness, and we're gonna set brightness to 65, which is basically increasing the sprite's brightness by 65%. And we're gonna put this one right before the wait second, and we're also gonna duplicate it and get rid of that chunk and set it back to 0 right before we delete the sprite. So sort of like just a flash. Okay, let's try this out. So you can see how the enemy sort of just kind of flashes like a ghost a little bit right before it dies. It's just a nice little graphic effect. Okay, and just for safety, there's one more thing I want to add, and that is when we start as a clone, sometimes you may get this bug, and it actually happened right then when I was just demoing the project, where when a next clone spawns in, if our brightness effect hasn't gone to 0 yet, it might spawn the next clone with like a different type of brightness. So to make sure this doesn't happen, just whenever the clone spawns in, just set brightness to 0. It's just a safety measure. You don't want to run into a bug that affects the game later. Okay. Now, with those out of the way, I think now we can start actually creating our counters for the game. And to do this, we're going to introduce one last final concept in our Scratch series, which is variables. And this is really important. So for this project, we're going to need 2 variables. And the first one we're going to do is create an enemies killed variable. So this is going to track the number of enemies we kill. So to do this, Scratch actually already created a variable for us, and we're just going to use it, but we're going to rename it. So let's right click on this variable and let's click rename. So we're going to change this from my variable to, let's call this enemies killed. I'm going to put a colon mark here because I'm going to change the way it appears on the screen. So now when I create this, we can actually display this value on the screen by clicking this check mark right here. So now it's showed on the screen, and the reason I put the colon mark is now it looks a little bit better when it appears on the screen because it's like 0 right here with a colon mark. Okay. Now, when we start off the game, of course, we want to set enemies killed to 0. And I'm going to put this in fighter because fighter is the one that's actually killing the enemies. So let's start off by setting this to 0. But every time we kill an enemy, we want to increase this variable. So to do this, let's go to enemy. And we're just going to put this block, the change enemies killed block by 1, right whenever the enemy is touching a bullet. So let's just put this right here. Doesn't really matter where you put it, just make sure it's above the 0.1 seconds. So let's try this out. Great. So now whenever I kill an enemy, you can see the counter start increasing. And even when the game ends, the counter is still displayed at the top, which is actually good. We want our user to know how many enemies they've taken down. And the last thing we want to add is one more counter that counts the time we've survived for. So let's create another variable, and let's call this one time survived. Of course, I spelled survived incorrectly. I just can't English today. Sorry. Time survived, and we're just gonna put this one up here too. And you can feel free to drag these ones around, so you can like drag it here and here. And you can even change the way they display by right-clicking it, and you can make it like different types of readouts. So you can make this like a normal readout, which is this by default. You can make it a large readout, which is just a number, and you can even make it a slider. But we do not want to mess with the slider right now, so we're just gonna make this the normal readout. Okay, great. And we're going to also set the time survived as 0 when we begin. But to track the time, we can't really just increase the time by 1 forever. That's not how time really works. And thankfully, to manage time, Scratch actually has a built-in system to do that. They have a nice thing called timer. So what we're basically going to do is take this timer variable, and for however long the game is running, we're just going to set the timer, the time survived value, to this timer value. So right now this timer is just taking up, and a weird thing Scratch does here is the timer, it keeps taking up even though the game ends, which is why we're going to store this in a variable and stop updating the variable when the game ends. So the time pauses the second our player dies. This will all make sense in a second. So let's get a set time survive block, and let's just put timer in here. And it's safe to just put this right into the forever block right here. So set time survive to timer. And one last thing we're going to need to do is go to sensing and get the reset timer. So when our project starts, we just want to reset the timer. This is just for safety to make sure no bugs happen. Okay, so let's run this and see what happens. Okay, great. So timer is going off at the top, and we can just take on our enemies. Oops, we died. And we can see that the enemies we've killed are 13, and we've survived for 14.6, around that time approximately seconds. Okay, so that is pretty much it for our fighter game tutorial. Now, feel free to rename the project like up here. We can call this fighter game, and you can share this with your friends and whatnot. You can also experiment around with the code, which I highly recommend. So you can go like to enemy and play around with like the spawn rate, which is this 1 second. You can even change the fire rate of the bullet, but I'll leave that to you to experiment with. And I think that brings us to the end of this tutorial video and the series for now. So thanks for joining me. I'll see you guys later.